Dracula by Bram Stoker. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 3rd May, Bistritz. Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but train was an hour late. I find that this district is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. I was not able to light on any map or work giving the exact locality of the castle, but I found that Bistritz, the post town named by Count Dracula, is a fairly well-known place. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Krone Hotel, which I found to my great delight to be thoroughly old-fashioned, for of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country. I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door, I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress. When I came close, she bowed and said, "The Herr Englishman?" "Yes," I said, "Jonathan Harker." She smiled and gave me a letter. My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow, the public coach will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass, my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula. 4th of May. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a very hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young Herr, must you go?" When I told her that I must go at once, and that I was engaged on important business, she went down on her knees and implored me not to. It was all very ridiculous, but I didn't feel comfortable. I soon lost sight and recollection of ghostly fears in the beauty of the scene as we drove along. Before us lay a green, sloping land full of forests and woods, with here and there steep hills crowned with clumps of trees or with farmhouses. Beyond the swelling hills rose mighty slopes of forest up to the lofty steeps of the Carpathians themselves. When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, and they kept speaking to the driver as though urging him to further speed. He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries of encouragement urged them on to further exertions. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side, and to frown down upon us. We were entering the Borgo Pass. I was now myself looking out for the conveyance which was to take me to the Count, but there was no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had best do, when the horses began to neigh and snort and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants, and a universal crossing of themselves, a calèche with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps, as the rays fell on them, that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see the gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight. As he turned to us, he said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth, with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth as white as ivory. Then I descended from the side of the coach as the calèche was close alongside, the driver helping me with a hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins. The horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. I felt a little strangely and not a little frightened. I think, had there been any alternative, I should have taken it, instead of prosecuting that unknown night journey. Then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling, pine-clad rock, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves, with white teeth and lolling red tongues, with long, sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. I called to the coachman and saw him stand in his seat. He swept his long arms as though brushing aside some impalpable obstacle. The wolves fell back, and back further still. Just then, a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so that we were again in darkness. When I could see again, the wolves had disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now in complete darkness. Suddenly, I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast, ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky. When the caleche stopped, the driver jumped down and held out his hand to assist me to alight. Again, I could not but notice his prodigious strength. The driver jumped again into his seat and shook the reins. The horses started forward, and trap and all disappeared down one of the dark openings. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Suddenly I heard a heavy step approaching behind the great door, and saw through the chinks the gleam of the coming light. Then there was the sound of rattling chains, and the clanking of massive bolts drawn back. A key was turned, with a loud grating noise of long disuse, and the great door swung back. Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven, save for a long white moustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of colour about him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp, throwing long, quivering shadows as it flickered in the draught of the open door. The old man motioned me in with his right hand with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely, and of your own will." He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed as cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. Again he said, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." Count Dracula? He bowed in a courtly way as he replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." As he was speaking, he put the lamp on a bracket on the wall, and stepping out, took my luggage. He had carried it in before I could forestall him. He insisted on carrying my luggage along the passage, and then up a great winding stair, and along another great passage on whose stone floor our steps rang heavily. Passing through this, he opened another door, and motioned me to enter. It was a welcome sight, for here was a great bedroom, well lighted, and warmed with another log fire, which sent a hollow roar up the wide chimney. The Count himself left my luggage inside and withdrew, saying, before he closed the door, "You will need, after your journey, to refresh yourself. I trust you will find all you wish. When you are ready, come into the other room, where you will find your supper prepared." The light and warmth and the Count's courteous welcome seemed to have dissipated all my doubts and fears. So making a hasty toilet, I went into the other room. I found supper already laid out. My host, who stood on one side of the great fireplace, leaning against the stonework, made a graceful wave of his hand to the table and said, "I pray you, be seated and sup how you please. You will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you, but I have dined already." The Count himself came forward and took off the cover of a dish, and I fell to at once on an excellent roast chicken. In time I had finished my supper, and by my host's desire had drawn up a chair by the fire and begun to smoke a cigar which he offered me, at the same time excusing himself that he did not smoke. I had now an opportunity of observing him, and found him of a very marked physiognomy. His face was a very strong, aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead, and hair growing scantily round the temples, but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm, though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. I noticed his hands as they lay on his knees in the firelight. Strange to say, there were hairs in the centre of the palm. The nails were long and fine, and cut to a sharp point. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me, which, do what I would, I could not conceal. The Count, evidently noticing it, drew back with a grim sort of smile. We were both silent for a while, and as I looked towards the window, I saw the first dim streak of the coming dawn. Then he rose and said, "But you must be tired. Your bedroom is all ready, and tomorrow you shall sleep as late as you will. I have to be away till the afternoon, so sleep well and dream well." 7th May. There are certainly odd deficiencies in the house, considering the extraordinary evidences of wealth which are around me. In none of the rooms is there a mirror. There is not even a toilette glass on my table, and I had to get the little shaving glass from my bag before I could either shave or brush my hair. I have not seen a servant anywhere, or heard a sound near the castle except the howling of wolves. In the library I found, to my great delight, a vast number of English books, whole shelves full of them, and bound volumes of magazines and newspapers. Whilst I was looking at the books, the door opened and the Count entered. He saluted me in a hearty way and hoped that I had had a good night's rest. Then he went on, "I am glad you found your way in here, for I am sure there is much that will interest you. These friends," and he laid his hand on some of the books, have been good friends to me. And for some years past, ever since I had the idea of going to London, they have given me many, many hours of pleasure. Through them, I have come to know your great England, and to know her is to love her. I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. Come, he said at last, tell me of London, and of the house which you have procured for me. With an apology for my remissness, I went into my own room to get the papers from my bag. We went thoroughly into the business of the purchase of the estate at Purfleet. When I had told him the facts, and got his signature to the necessary papers, and had written a letter to my employer, Mr. Hawkins, he began to ask me how I had come across so suitable a place. I read to him the notes which I had made at the time, and which I inscribe here. The estate is called Carfax. The house is very large, and of all periods, back, I should say, to medieval times, for one part is of stone immensely thick, with only a few windows high up and heavily barred with iron. It looks like part of a keep, and is close to an old chapel or church. There are but few houses close at hand, one being a very large house, only recently formed into a private lunatic asylum. It is not, however, visible from the grounds. When I had finished, he said, I'm glad that it is old and big. I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love not to think that our bones may be amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety, nor mirth, nor the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling waters which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart, through weary years of mourning over the dead, is not attuned to mirth. Moreover, the walls of my castle are broken, the shadows are many, and the wind breathes cold through the broken battlements and casements. I love the shade and the shadow, and would be alone with my thoughts when I may. 8th May. There is something so strange about this place and all in it that I cannot but feel uneasy. I wish I was safe out of it, or that I had never come. It may be that this strange night existence is telling on me, but would that that were all. I only slept a few hours when I went to bed, and feeling that I could not sleep any more, got up. I had hung my shaving glass by the window, and was just beginning to shave. Suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder, and heard the Count's voice saying to me, "Good morning." I started, for it amazed me that I had not seen him, since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me. In starting, I had cut myself slightly, but did not notice it at the moment. Having answered the Count's salutation, I turned to the glass again to see how I had been mistaken. This time there could be no error, for the man was close to me, and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of a man in it, except myself. But at that instant I saw that the cut had bled a little, and the blood was trickling over my chin. I laid down the razor, turning as I did so, When the Count saw my face, his eyes blazed with a sort of demoniac fury, and he suddenly made a grab at my throat. I drew away, and his hand touched the string of beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him, for the fury passed so quickly that I could hardly believe that it was ever there. "Take care," he said. "Take care how you cut yourself. It is more dangerous than you think in this country." Then, seizing the shaving glass, he went on, "And this is the wretched thing that has done the mischief. It is a foul bauble of man's vanity. Away with it!" And opening the heavy window with one wrench of his terrible hand, he flung out the glass, which was shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stones of the courtyard far below. Then he withdrew, without a word. After breakfast, I did a little exploring in the castle. I went out on the stairs and found a room looking towards the south. The view was magnificent. But I am not in heart to describe beauty, for when I had seen the view, I explored further. Doors, doors, doors everywhere, and all locked and bolted. In no place, save from the windows in the castle walls, is there an available exit. The castle is a veritable prison, and I am a prisoner. 9th May, midnight. I have had a long talk with the Count. I asked him a few questions on Transylvanian history, and he warmed up to the subject wonderfully, especially of battles. He spoke as if he'd been present at them all. "We, Dracula, have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Ah, young sir, the Dracula, their heart's blood, their brains, and their swords can boast a record that mushroom growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs can never reach. The warlike days are over. Blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace, and the glories of the great races are as a tale that is told." It was by this time close on morning, and we went to bed. 16th May. God preserve my sanity, for to this I am reduced. Safety and the assurance of safety are things of the past. Whilst I live on here, there is but one thing to hope for, that I may not go mad, if indeed I be not mad already. Last night I went to my room. After a little while, not hearing any sound, I came out and went up the stone stair to where I could look out towards the south. As I leaned from the window, my eye was caught by something moving a story below me. What I saw was the Count's head coming out from the window. I was at first interested and somewhat amused, but my feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. What manner of man is this? Or what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man? I knew he had left the castle now, and thought to use the opportunity to explore more than I had dared to do as yet. I went back to the room, and taking a lamp, tried all the doors. They were all locked, as I had expected. At last, however, I found one door at the top of a stairway, which, though it seemed to be locked, gave a little under pressure. Evidently I was now in a wing of the castle occupied in bygone days, for the furniture had more air of comfort than any I had seen. After trying a little to school my nerves, I found a soft quietude come over me. I sat at a little oak table where in old times possibly some fair lady sat to pen her ill-spelt love letter, and writing in my diary in shorthand all that has happened since I closed it last. When I had written in my diary, and had fortunately replaced the book and pen in my pocket, the sense of sleep was upon me. I suppose I must have fallen asleep, but I fear all that followed was startlingly real. I was not alone. The room was the same, unchanged in any way since I came into it. I could see along the floor in the brilliant moonlight my own footsteps marked where I had disturbed a long accumulation of dust. In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time that I must be dreaming when I saw them, for though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. They came close to me and looked at me for some time and then whispered together. 2 were dark and had high aquiline noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the pale yellow moon. The other was fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed somehow to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at the moment how or where. All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It is not good to note this down, lest some day it should meet Mina's eyes and cause her pain, but it is the truth. They whispered together, and then they all 3 laughed. Such a silvery musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound never could have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other 2 urged her on. One said, "Go on. You are first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin." The other added, "He is young and strong. There are kisses for us all." I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in an agony of delightful anticipation. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying sweet, a bitter offensiveness, as one smells in blood. I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The fair girl went on her knees and bent over me, fairly gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal. till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that has tickled it approaches nearer, nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. But at that instant, another sensation swept through me as quick as lightning. I was conscious of the presence of the Count, and of his being as if lapped in a storm of fury. As my eyes opened involuntarily, I saw his strong hand grasp the slender neck of the fair woman, and with giant's power draw it back, the blue eyes transformed with fury, the white teeth champing with rage, and the fair cheeks blazing red with passion. But the Count! Never did I imagine such wrath and fury, even in the demons of the pit. His eyes were positively blazing. The red light in them was lurid, as if the flames of hell fire blazed behind them. His face was deathly pale, and the lines of it were hard like drawn wires. The thick eyebrows that met over the nose now seemed like a heaving bar of white-hot metal. With a fierce sweep of his arm, he hurled the woman from him, and then motioned to the others as though he were beating them back. It was the same imperious gesture that I had seen used to the wolves. In a voice which, though low and almost a whisper, seemed to cut through the air and then ring around the room, he exclaimed, "How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go, go. I must awaken him, for there is work to be done." "Are we to have nothing tonight?" said one of them with a low laugh, as she pointed to the bag which he had thrown upon the floor, and which moved as though there were some living thing within it. For answer, he nodded his head. One of the women jumped forward and opened it. If my ears did not deceive me, there was a gasp and a low wail as of a half-smothered child. The women closed round, whilst I was aghast with horror. But as I looked, they disappeared, and with them the dreadful bag. There was no door near them, and they could not have passed me without my noticing. They simply seemed to fade into the rays of the moonlight and pass out through the window, for I could see outside the dim, shadowy forms for a moment before they entirely faded away. Then the horror overcame me, and I sank down unconscious. May. I am surely in the toils. Last night the Count asked me in the suavest tones to write 3 letters, one saying that my work here was nearly done and that I should start for home within a few days. Another, that I was starting on the next morning from the time of the letter. And the third, that I had left the castle and arrived at Bistritz. I asked him what dates I should put on the letters. He calculated a minute and then said, "The first should be June 12, the second June 19, and the third June 29. I know now the span of my life. God help me. 17th June. This morning, as I was sitting on the edge of my bed, cudgelling my brains, I heard without a cracking of whips and pounding and scraping of horses' feet up the rocky path beyond the courtyard. With joy I hurried to the window and saw drive into the yard 2 great lighter wagons, each drawn by 8 sturdy horses, and at the head of each pair a Slovak with his wide hat, great nail-studded belt, dirty sheepskin, and high boots. But no effort of mine, no piteous cry or agonized entreaty would make them even look at me. They resolutely turned away. The lighter wagons contained great square boxes with handles of thick rope. They were evidently empty by the ease with which the Slovaks handled them, and by their resonance as they were roughly moved. 21st June. Before morning. Last night the Count left me early and locked himself into his own room. Suddenly I heard a sound in the courtyard without, the agonized cry of a woman. "Monster! Give me my child!" She threw herself on her knees, and raising up her hands, cried the same words in tones which wrung my heart. Then she tore her hair and beat her breast, and abandoned herself to all the violences of extravagant emotion. Finally, she threw herself forward, and although I could not see her, I could hear the beating of her naked hands against the door. Somewhere, high overhead, probably on the tower, I heard the voice of the Count calling in his harsh metallic whisper. His call seemed to be answered from far and wide by the howling of wolves. Before many minutes had passed, a pack of them poured like a pent-up dam when liberated through the wide entrance into the courtyard. There was no cry from the woman, and the howling of the wolves was but short. Before long, they streamed away singly, licking their lips. I could not pity her, for I knew now what had become of her child, and she was better dead. What shall I do? What can I do? How can I escape from this dreadful thrall of night and gloom and fear? 29th June. Today is the date of my last letter, the last of that fatal series which is to blot out the very traces of my existence from the earth. I went, whilst my courage was fresh, straight to the window on the south side, and at once got outside on the narrow ledge of stone which runs round the building on this side. I knew pretty well the direction and distance of the Count's window, and made for it as well as I could, till I found myself standing on the window-sill and trying to raise up the sash. I was filled with agitation, however, when I bent down and slid feet foremost in through the window. The room was empty. At one corner was a heavy door. I tried it. It was open, and led through a stone passage to a circular stairway which went steeply down. At the bottom there was a dark tunnel-like passage through which came a deathly, sickly odour, the odour of old earth newly turned. As I went through the passage, the smell grew closer and heavier. At last I pulled open a heavy door which stood ajar, and found myself in an old ruined chapel which had evidently been used as a graveyard. The ground had recently been dug over, and the earth placed in great wooden boxes, manifestly those which had been brought by the Slovaks. There, in one of the great boxes, on a pile of newly dug earth, lay the Count. He was either dead or asleep. I could not say which, for the eyes were open and stony, but without the glassiness of death. But there was no sign of movement, no pulse, no breath, no beating of the heart. He looked as if his youth had been half renewed, for the white hair and moustache were changed to dark iron grey. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. Even the deep burning eyes seemed set amongst swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. A terrible desire came upon me to rid the world of such a monster. There was no lethal weapon at hand, but I seized a shovel which the workmen had been using to fill the cases, and lifting it high, struck with the edge downward at the hateful face. But as I did so, the head turned, and the eyes fell full upon me, with all their blaze of basilisk horror. The sight seemed to paralyze me, and the shovel turned in my hand and glanced from the face, merely making a deep gash above the forehead. The shovel fell from my hand across the box, and as I pulled it away, the flange of the blade caught the edge of the lid, which fell over again and hid the horrid thing from my sight. The last glimpse I had was of the bloated face, blood-stained and fixed with a grin of malice which would have held its own in the nethermost hell. I thought and thought what should be my next move, but my brain seemed on fire. I heard in the distance a gypsy song, sung by merry voices coming closer, and through their song the rolling of heavy wheels and the cracking of whips. The Slovaks were coming. I ran from the place and gained the Count's room. I was a prisoner, and the net of doom was closing round me more closely. As I write, there is in the passage below a sound of many tramping feet, and the crash of weights being set down heavily, doubtless the boxes with their freight of earth. There is a sound of hammering. It is the box being nailed down. Now I can hear in the courtyard and down the rocky way the roll of heavy wheels, the crack of whips, and the chorus of the gypsies as they pass into the distance. I'm alone in the castle with those awful women. I shall not remain alone with them. I shall try to scale the castle wall farther than I have yet attempted. I may find a way from this dreadful place, and then away for home, away to the quickest and nearest train, away from this cursed spot, from this cursed land, where the devil and his children still walk with earthly feet. At least God's mercy is better than that of these monsters, and the precipice is steep and high. At its foot a man may sleep as a man. Goodbye, all. Mina Murray's Journal. 24th July, Whitby. Lucy met me at the station, looking sweeter and lovelier than ever, and we drove up to the house at the Crescent in which they have rooms. There Lucy and I sat a while, and it was all so beautiful before us that we took hands as we sat, and she told me all about her coming marriage. She said, "My dear Mina, it never rains but it pours. How true the old proverbs are. Here am I, who will be 20 in September, and yet I never had a proposal, and then in one day I had 3. Just fancy. I feel sorry, really, and truly sorry, for 2 of the poor fellows. Number 1 came just before lunch. I told you of him, Dr. John Seward, the lunatic asylum man. He is a doctor and really clever. Just fancy, he's only 9 and 20, and he has an immense lunatic asylum all under his own care. Well, my dear, number 2 came after lunch. Mr. Quincy P. Morris is an American from Texas, and he looks so young and so fresh that it seems almost impossible that he's been to so many places and has had such adventures. Oh, about number 3. I needn't tell you of number 3, need I? He is the Honourable Arthur Homewood, only son of Lord Godalming. He's coming up here very shortly, as soon as he can leave town, for his father's not very well. It was all so confused. It seemed only a moment from his coming into the room till both his arms were round me and he was kissing me. I'm very, very happy, and I don't know what I've done to deserve it. Lucy's excitement made me just a little heartsick, for I haven't heard from Jonathan for a whole month. 8th August. Lucy was very restless all night, and I too could not sleep. The storm was fearful, and as it boomed loudly among the chimney pots it made me shudder. When a sharp puff came, it seemed to be like a distant gun. Strangely enough, Lucy did not wake, but she got up twice and dressed herself. Fortunately, each time I awoke in time and managed to undress her without waking her and got her back to bed. I heard in the morning that the schooner was shipwrecked in the harbour, pitching herself up on the sand heap by the East Pier. And, strangest of all, the very instant the shore was touched, an immense dog sprang up on deck from below, as if shot up by the concussion, and running forward, jumped from the bow onto the sand. Making straight for the steep cliff, it disappeared in the darkness. It turns out that the schooner is a Russian from Varna, and is called the Demeter. She is almost entirely in ballast of silver sand, with only a small amount of cargo, a number of great wooden boxes filled with mould. 11th August, 3 a.m. I'm too agitated to sleep. We've had such an adventure, such an agonizing experience. I fell asleep as soon as I had closed my diary. Suddenly I became broad awake and sat up with a horrible sense of fear upon me. Lucy's bed was empty. I feared to wake her mother, who has been more than usually ill lately, so threw on some clothes and got ready to look for her. At the edge of the west cliff above the pier, I looked across the harbour to the east cliff, in the hope, or fear, I don't know which, of seeing Lucy. My expectation was not disappointed, for there, on our favourite seat, the silver light of the moon struck a half-reclining figure, snowy white. But it seemed to me as though something dark stood behind the seat, where the white figure shone, bent over it. What it was, whether man or beast, I could not tell. When I got almost to the top, I could see the seat and the white figure, for I was now close enough to distinguish it, even through the spells of shadow. There was undoubtedly something long and black, bending over the half-reclining white figure. I called in fright, "Lucy! Lucy!" And something raised a head, and from where I was I could see a white face and red, gleaming eyes. Lucy did not answer, and I ran on to the entrance of the churchyard. As I entered, the church was between me and the seat, and for a minute or so I lost sight of her. When I came in view again, I could see Lucy half reclining with her head lying over the back of the seat. She was quite alone, and there was not a sign of any living thing about. When I bent over her, I could see that she was still asleep. Her lips were parted, and she was breathing, not softly as usual with her, but in long, heavy gasps, as though striving to get her lungs full at every breath. As I came close, she put up her hand in her sleep and pulled the collar of her nightdress close round her throat. Whilst she did so, there came a little shudder through her, as though she felt the cold. She trembled a little and clung to me. When I told her to come at once with me home, she rose without a word, with the obedience of a child. Fortune favoured us, and we got home without meeting a soul. When we got in and had said a prayer of thankfulness together, I tucked her into bed. 19th August. Joy, joy, joy. Although not all joy. At last, news of Jonathan. The dear fellow has been ill. That is why he didn't write. I'm not afraid to think it or to say it, now that I know. Letter Sister Agatha, Hospital of St. Joseph and St. Mary, Budapest, to Miss Wilhelmina Murray, 12th August. Dear Madam, I write by desire of Mr. Jonathan Harker, who is himself not strong enough to write, though progressing well, thanks to God and St. Joseph and St. Mary. He has been under our care for nearly 6 weeks, suffering from a violent brain fever. He wishes me to convey his love, and he has told me all about you, and that you are shortly to be his wife. All blessings to you both. He has had some fearful shock, so says our doctor, and in his delirium his ravings have been dreadful, of wolves and poison and blood, of ghosts and demons, and I fear to say of what. Yours with sympathy and all blessings, Sister Agatha. Mr. Hawkins sent me on this letter, and wrote himself, oh, so kindly. I am to leave in the morning, and to go over to Jonathan, and to help to nurse him if necessary, and to bring him home. Mr. Hawkins says it would not be a bad thing if we were to be married out there. I must write no more. I must keep it to say to Jonathan, my husband. Dr. Seward's diary, kept in phonograph. 10th August. Ebb tide in appetite today. Cannot eat, cannot rest, so diary instead. Since my rebuff by Lucy, I have a sort of empty feeling. Nothing in the world seems of sufficient importance to be worth the doing. As I knew that the only cure for this sort of thing was work, I went down amongst the patients. I picked out one who has afforded me a study of much interest. He is so quaint in his ideas and so unlike the normal lunatic that I have determined to understand him as well as I can. R. M. Renfield, ETAT 59, sanguine temperament, great physical strength, morbidly excitable, periods of gloom. He has certain qualities very largely developed: selfishness, secrecy, and purpose. I wish I could get at what is the object of the latter. He seems to have some settled scheme of his own, but what it is I do not yet know. 19th August. Strange and sudden change in Renfield last night. At 9 o'clock, the night watchman came to see me, sent up from the ward to say that Renfield had escaped. I ran as quickly as I could. As I got through the belt of trees, I saw a white figure scale the high wall which separates our grounds from those of the deserted house. I ran back at once and told the watchman to get 3 or 4 men immediately and follow me into the grounds of Carfax in case our friend might be dangerous. I got a ladder myself, and crossing the wall, dropped down on the other side. I could see Renfield's figure just disappearing behind the angle of the house, so I ran after him. On the far side of the house, I found him pressed close against the old iron-bound oak door of the chapel. My men had now crossed the wall and were closing him in. I heard him say, "I am here to do your bidding, master. I am your slave, and you will reward me, for I shall be faithful. I have worshipped you long and afar off. Now that you are near, I await your commands, and you will not pass me by, will you, dear master, in your distribution of good things?" As we were holding him, a strange thing happened. He suddenly redoubled his efforts, and then, as suddenly, grew calm. I looked round instinctively, but could see nothing. Then I caught the patient's eye and followed it, but could trace nothing as it looked into the moonlit sky except a big bat, which was flapping its silent and ghostly way to the west. Bats usually wheel and flit about, but this one seemed to go straight on, as if it knew where it was bound for, or had some intention of its own. The patient grew calmer every instant, and presently said, "You needn't tie me. I shall go quietly." Without trouble, we came back to the house. I feel there is something ominous in his calm, and I shall not forget this night. 31st August. Arthur Homewood writes to me that Lucy is ill and asks me to attend her. Arthur himself is summoned to see his father, who is apparently very sick. Letter from Dr. Seward to Arthur Homewood, 2nd September. My dear old fellow, with regard to Miss Westenra's health, I hasten to let you know at once that in my opinion there is not any functional disturbance or any malady that I know of. At the same time, I am not by any means satisfied with her appearance. I could easily see that she is somewhat bloodless, but I could not see the usual anemic signs. In other physical matters I was quite satisfied that there is no need for anxiety, but as there must be a cause somewhere, I have come to the conclusion that it must be something mental. She complains of difficulty in breathing satisfactorily at times, and of heavy lethargic sleep with dreams that frighten her, but regarding which she can remember nothing. I am in doubt, and so have done the best thing I know of. I have written to my old friend and master, Professor Van Helsing of Amsterdam, who knows as much about obscure diseases as anyone in the world. Mrs. Westenra was naturally anxious concerning Lucy, and I told her that my old master, Van Helsing, the great specialist, was coming to stay with me, and that I would put her in his charge, conjointly with myself. So now we can come and go without alarming her unduly. If any need, I shall write, so that if you do not hear from me, take it for granted that I am simply waiting for news. In haste, yours ever, John Seward. Dr. Seward's Diary. 7th September. The first thing Van Helsing said to me when we met at Liverpool Street was, "Have you said anything to our young friend, the lover of her?" "No," I said. When I described Lucy's symptoms, he looked very grave, but said nothing. When we were shown in, Mrs. Westenra met us. She was alarmed, but not nearly so much as I expected to find her. Van Helsing and I were shown up to Lucy's room. If I was shocked when I saw her yesterday, I was horrified when I saw her today. She was ghastly, chalkily pale. The red seemed to have gone even from her lips and gums, and the bones of her face stood out prominently. Her breathing was painful to see or hear. Van Helsing's face grew set as marble, and his eyebrows converged till they almost touched over his nose. Lucy lay motionless and didn't seem to have strength to speak, so for a while we were all silent. Then Van Helsing beckoned to me, and we went gently out of the room. "My God," he said, "this is dreadful. There is no time to be lost. She will die for sheer want of blood to keep the heart's action as it should be. There must be transfusion of blood at once. Is it you or me?" "I am younger and stronger, Professor. It must be me." "Then get ready at once. I will bring up my bag. I am prepared." I went downstairs with him, and as we reached the hall, the maid had just opened the door, and Arthur was stepping quickly in. He rushed up to me, saying in an eager whisper, "Jack, I was so anxious. I read between the lines of your letter, and I've been in an agony. The dad was better, so I ran down here to see for myself. Is not that gentleman Dr. Van Helsing? I'm so grateful to you, sir, for coming." Van Helsing said to him gravely as he held out his hand, "Sir, you have come in time. You are the lover of our dear miss. She is bad, very, very bad. You are to help her. You can do more than any that live, and your courage is your best help." "What can I do?" asked Arthur hoarsely. "Tell me, and I shall do it. My life is hers, and I would give the last drop of blood in my body for her." We all went up to Lucy's room. Arthur, by direction, remained outside. Lucy turned her head and looked at us, but said nothing. She was not asleep, but she was simply too weak to make the effort. Her eyes spoke to us, that was all. Van Helsing took some things from his bag and laid them on a little table out of sight, then gave her a narcotic, and she fell into a deep sleep. Then, with swiftness but with absolute method, Van Helsing performed the operation. As the transfusion went on, something like life seemed to come back to poor Lucy's cheeks, and through Arthur's growing pallor, the joy of his face seemed absolutely to shine. After a bit, I began to grow anxious, for the loss of blood was telling on Arthur, strong man as he was. It gave me an idea what a terrible strain Lucy's system must have undergone, that what weakened Arthur only partially restored her. But the professor's face was set, and he stood watch in hand, and with his eyes fixed now on the patient and now on Arthur, I could hear my own heart beat. Presently, he said in a soft voice, "It is enough. You attend him, I will look to her." And as he had now finished his operation, he adjusted the pillow to the patient's head. As he did so, the narrow black velvet band, which she seemed always to wear round her throat, buckled with an old diamond buckle which her lover had given her, was dragged a little up and showed a red mark on her throat. Arthur didn't notice it, but I could hear the deep hiss of indrawn breath, which is one of Van Helsing's ways of betraying emotion. I asked the professor in a whisper, "What do you make of that mark on her throat?" "What do you make of it?" "I have not seen it yet," I answered, and then and there proceeded to loose the band. Just over the external jugular vein, there were 2 punctures, not large, but not wholesome-looking. There was no sign of disease, but the edges were white and worn-looking. It at once occurred to me that this wound, or whatever it was, might be the means of that manifest loss of blood, but I abandoned the idea as soon as formed, for such a thing could not be. The whole bed would have been drenched to a scarlet with the blood which the girl must have lost to leave such a pallor as she had before the transfusion. "Well?" said Van Helsing. "Well," said I can make nothing of it." The professor stood up. "I must go back to Amsterdam tonight," he said. "There are books and things there which I want. You must remain here all the night, and you must not let your sight pass from her. I shall be back as soon as possible, and then we may begin." "May begin?" I said. "What on earth do you mean?" "We shall see," he answered as he hurried out. 12th September. With regard to patient Renfield, he has had another outbreak which might have had a dreadful ending, but which, as it fortunately happened, was unattended with any unhappy results. This afternoon, a carrier's cart with 2 men made a call at the empty house whose grounds abut on ours, the house to which the patient ran away. Half an hour later, Renfield broke out through the window of his room and was running down the avenue. I called to the attendants to follow me, and I ran after him, for I feared he was intent on some mischief. My fear was justified when I saw the same cart which had passed before coming down the road, having on it some great wooden boxes. The men were wiping their foreheads and were flushed in the face as if with violent exercise. Before I could get up to him, the patient rushed at them and, pulling one of them off the cart, began to knock his head against the ground. If I hadn't seized him just at the moment, I believe he would have killed the man there and then. The 2 carriers were at first loud in their threats of actions for damages, but with each a sovereign in hand, they made light of the attack. 18th September. Surely there is some horrible doom hanging over us, that every possible accident should thwart us in all we try to do. I drove to Hillingham and arrived at 10 in the morning. Then we ascended to Lucy's room. For an instant or two, we paused at the door to listen, but there was no sound that we could hear. With white faces and trembling hands, we opened the door gently and entered the room. How shall I describe what we saw? On the bed lay 2 women, Lucy and her mother. The latter lay farthest in, and she was covered with a white sheet, the edge of which had been blown back by the draught through the broken window, showing the drawn white face with a look of terror fixed upon it. By her side lay Lucy, with face white and still more drawn. The flowers which had been round her neck we found upon her mother's bosom, and her throat was bare, showing the 2 little wounds which we had noticed before, but looking horribly white and mangled. Without a word, the professor bent over the bed, his head almost touching poor Lucy's breast. Then he gave a quick turn of his head, and leaping to his feet, he cried out to me, "It is not too late! Quick!" We took Lucy into another room, which had by now been prepared, and laid her in bed and forced a few drops of brandy down her throat. I noticed that Van Helsing tied a soft silk handkerchief round her throat. He was evidently torturing his mind about something, so I waited for an instant, and he spoke. "We must have another transfusion of blood, and that soon. What are we to do for someone who will open his veins for her?" "What's the matter with me, anyhow?" The voice came from the sofa across the room, and its tones brought relief and joy to my heart, for they were those of Quincey Morris. Van Helsing started angrily at the first sound, but his face softened and a glad look came into his eyes as I cried out, "Quincey Morris!" and rushed towards him with outstretched hands. "I think I came just in the nick of time. You know you only have to tell me what to do." Once again we went through that ghastly operation. I have not the heart to go through with the details. Lucy had got a terrible shock. Her struggle back into life was something frightful to see and hear. However, the action of both heart and lungs improved, and Van Helsing made a subcutaneous injection of morphia as before, and with good effect. Her faint became a profound slumber. The professor watched whilst I went downstairs with Quincey Morris. I left Quincey lying down after having a glass of wine, and I went back to the room where Lucy now was. When I came softly in, I found Van Helsing with a sheet or 2 of notepaper in his hand. He had evidently read it, and was thinking it over as he sat with his hand to his brow. There was a look of grim satisfaction in his face, as of one who has had a doubt solved. He handed me the papers, saying only, It dropped from Lucy's breast when we carried her to the bath. Memorandum left by Lucy Westenra. 17th September, night. I write this and leave it to be seen. This is an exact record of what took place tonight. I feel I am dying of weakness and have barely strength to write. But it must be done, if I die in the doing. I was waked by the flapping at the window, which had begun after that sleepwalking on the cliff at Whitby, when Mina saved me, and which now I know so well. And outside in the shrubbery I heard a sort of howl like a dog's, but more fierce and deeper. I went to the window and looked out, but could see nothing except the big bat, which had evidently been buffeting its wings against the window. So I went back to bed again, but determined not to go to sleep. Presently the door opened, and Mother looked in. Seeing by my moving that I was not asleep, came in and sat by me. I was uneasy about you dying, and came in to see that you were all right. As she lay there in my arms, and I in hers, and flapping and buffeting came to the window again. She was startled and a little frightened, and cried out, "What's that?" There was the low howl again out in the shrubbery. And shortly after that, there was a crash at the window, and a lot of broken glass was hurled on the floor. The window blind blew back where the wind rushed in, and there was the head of a great, gaunt, grey wolf. Mother cried out in a fright and clutched wildly at anything that would help her. Amongst other things, she clutched the wreath of flowers that Dr. Bennet Helsing insisted on my wearing round my neck, and tore it away from me. For a second or two she sat up, pointing at the wolf, and there was a strange and horrible gurgling in her throat. Then she fell over, as if struck with lightning. I tried to stir, but there was some spell upon me, and dear Mother's poor body weighed me down. I remember no more for a while. The time didn't seem long, but very, very awful, till I recovered consciousness again. Somewhere near, a passing bell was tolling. The dogs, all round the neighbourhood, were howling. I called the maids, but got no answer. What am I to do? What am I to do? Goodbye, dear Arthur. If I should not survive this night, God keep you, dear. God help me. When I had read it, I stood looking at the professor, and after a pause I asked him, "In God's name, what does it all mean? Was she, or is she, mad? Or what sort of horrible danger is it?" I was so bewildered that I did not know what to say more. Van Helsing put out his hand and took the paper, saying, "Do not trouble about it now. Forget it for the present. You shall know and understand it all in good time." When she woke late in the afternoon, Lucy was very low in thought and spirit, and wept silently and weakly for a long time. In the afternoon she asked for Arthur, and we telegraphed for him. We told her that either or both of us would now remain with her all the time, and that seemed to comfort her. 19th September. Only resolution and habit can let me make an entry tonight. I am too miserable, too low-spirited, too sick of the world and all in it, including life itself. At 6 o'clock, Van Helsing came to relieve me. Arthur had then fallen into a doze, and he mercifully let him sleep on. When he saw Lucy's face, he bent down and, with his face almost touching Lucy's, examined her carefully. He removed the flowers and lifted the silk handkerchief from her throat. As he did so, he started back, and I could hear his "My God!" as it was smothered in his throat. I bent over and looked too, and as I noticed, some queer chill came over me. The wounds on the throat had absolutely disappeared. For fully 5 minutes, Van Helsing stood looking at her with his face at its sternest. Then he turned to me and said calmly, "She is dying. It will not be long now. It will be much difference, mark me, whether she dies conscious or in her sleep. Wake that poor boy, and let him come and see the last. He trusts us, and we have promised him." I went to the dining room and waked him. When we came into the room, she opened her eyes, and seeing him, whispered softly, "Arthur, oh my love, I am so glad you've come." And then, insensibly, there came the strange change which I had noticed in the night. Her breathing grew stertorous, the mouth opened, and the pale gums, drawn back, made the teeth look longer and sharper than ever. In a sort of sleep-waking, vague, unconscious way, she opened her eyes, which were now dull and hard at once, and said in a soft, voluptuous voice, such as I had never heard from her lips, "Arthur, oh my love, I am so glad you have come. Kiss me." Arthur bent eagerly over to kiss her, but at that instant Van Helsing, who, like me, had been startled by her voice, swooped upon him and, catching him by the neck with both hands, dragged him back with a fury of strength which I never thought he could have possessed, and actually hurled him almost across the room. "Not for your life," he said. "Not for your living soul and hers." And he stood between them like a lion at bay. Arthur was so taken aback that he did not for a moment know what to do or say, and before any impulse of violence could seize him, he realized the place and the occasion, and he stood silent, waiting. I kept my eyes fixed on Lucy, as did Van Helsing, and we saw a spasm as of rage flit like a shadow over her face, the sharp teeth champed together. Then her eyes closed, and she breathed heavily. Very shortly after, she opened her eyes in all their softness, and putting out her poor, pale, thin hand, took Van Helsing's great brown one. Drawing it to her, she kissed it. "My true friend," she said in a faint voice, but with untellable pathos. "My true friend, and his. Oh, guard him, and give him peace." "I swear it," said he solemnly, kneeling beside her and holding up his hand as one who registers an oath. Then he turned to Arthur and said to him, "Come, my child, take her hand in yours, and kiss her on the forehead, and only once." Their eyes met instead of their lips, and so they parted. Lucy's eyes closed, and Van Helsing, who had been watching closely, took Arthur's arm and drew him away. And then Lucy's breathing became stertorous again, and all at once it ceased. "It is all over," said Van Helsing. "She is dead." I took Arthur by the arm and led him away to the drawing-room, where he sat down and covered his face with his hands, sobbing in a way that nearly broke me down to see. I went back to the room, stood beside Van Helsing, and said, well, poor girl, there is peace for her at last. It is the end." He turned to me and said with grave solemnity, "Not so, alas, not so. It is only the beginning." When I asked him what he meant, he only shook his head and answered, "We can do nothing as yet. Wait and see." Mina Harker's Journal. 22nd September. A sad homecoming in every way. Jonathan still pale and dizzy under a slight relapse of his malady. And now a telegram from Dr. Van Helsing, whoever he may be. "You will be grieved to hear that Mrs. Westenra died 5 days ago, and that Lucy died the day before yesterday. They were both buried today." Oh, what a wealth of sorrow in a few words. Van Helsing said that he had read my letters to poor Lucy, and is coming to see me at once. Dr. Seward's Diary, 27th September. Today, Van Helsing almost bounded into the room at about 5:30 and thrust last night's Westminster Gazette into my hand. "What do you think of that?" he asked as he stood back and folded his arms. I looked over the paper, for I really did not know what he meant, but he took it from me and pointed out a paragraph about children being decoyed away at Hampstead. It did not convey much to me until I reached a passage where it described small punctured wounds on their throats. An idea struck me, and I looked up. "Well," he said, "it is like poor Lucy's. And what do you make of it?" "Simply that there is some cause in common." "You think, then, that those so small holes in the children's throats were made by the same that made the hole in Miss Lucy?" "I suppose so." He stood up and said solemnly, "Then you are wrong. Oh, would it were so, but alas, no. It is worse, far, far worse." "In God's name, Professor Van Helsing, what do you mean?" I cried. He threw himself with a despairing gesture into a chair and placed his elbows on the table, covering his face with his hands as he spoke. "They were made by Miss Lucy." For a while sheer anger mastered me. It was as if he had, during her life, struck Lucy on the face. I smote the table hard and rose up as I said to him, "Dr. Van Helsing, are you mad?" He raised his head and looked at me, and somehow the tenderness of his face calmed me at once. "Would I were," he said. "Madness were easy to bear compared with truth like this. Oh, my friend, tomorrow night I go to prove it. Dare you come with me?" He saw my hesitation and spoke. "Tomorrow night you will come to me at the Berkeley Hotel at 10 of the clock. I shall send for Arthur to come too, and also that so fine young man of America that gave his blood. Later we shall all have work to do. I come with you so far as Piccadilly, and there dine, for I must go before the sun set." 29th September, morning. Last night, at a little before 10 o'clock, Arthur and Quincy came into Van Helsing's room. He told us all that he wanted us to do, but especially addressing himself to Arthur, as if all our wills were centered in his. He began by saying that he hoped we would all come with him too, for, he said, there is a grave duty to be done there. You were doubtless surprised at my letter? This query was directly addressed to Arthur. I was. It rather upset me for a bit. There's been so much trouble around my house of late that I could do without any more. Van Helsing continued, I want your permission to do what I think good this night. I want you to come with me and to come in secret to the churchyard where poor Lucy is buried. Arthur asked, And when there? To enter the tomb. Arthur stood up. Professor, are you in earnest, or is it some monstrous joke? Oh, pardon me, I see that you are in earnest. He sat down again, but I could see that he sat firmly and proudly as one who is on his dignity. There was silence until he asked again, And when in the tomb? To open the coffin. Arthur looked up with set white face and said, Take care, sir, take care. After a pause, Van Helsing went on, evidently with an effort. Miss Lucy is dead, is it not so? Yes. Then there can be no wrong to her. But if she be not dead— Arthur jumped to his feet. Good God, he cried, what do you mean? Has there been any mistake? Has she been buried alive? He groaned in anguish that not even hope would soften. I did not say that she was alive, my child. I did not think it. I go no further than to say that she might be undead. Undead? Not alive? What do you mean? Is this all a nightmare, or what is it? I beseech you, do not go forth in anger with me. In the long life of acts which were often not pleasant to do and which sometimes did wring my heart, I have never had so heavy a task as now. He said this with a very grave, sweet pride, and Arthur was much affected by it. He took the old man's hand and said in a broken voice, Oh, it is hard to think of it, and I cannot understand, but at least I will go with you and wait. It was just a quarter before 12 o'clock when we got into the churchyard. The professor unlocked the door, and seeing a natural hesitation amongst us for various reasons, solved the difficulty by entering first himself. The rest of us followed, and he closed the door. He then lit a dark lantern and went about his work systematically, holding his lamp so that he could read the coffin plates. He made assurance of Lucy's coffin. Another search in his bag, and he took out a turn-screw. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "To open the coffin. You shall yet be convinced." Straightway he began taking out the screws, and finally lifted off the lid, showing the casing of lead beneath. The sight was almost too much for me. It seemed to be as much an affront to the dead as it would have been to have stripped off her clothing in her sleep whilst living. And again, fumbling in his bag, took out a tiny fret saw. Striking the turn-screw through the lead with a swift downward stab which made me wince, he made a small hole, which was, however, big enough to admit the point of the saw. I had expected a rush of gas from the weak old corpse. We doctors, who have had to study our dangers, have to become accustomed to such things, and I drew back towards the door. But the professor never stopped for a moment. He sawed down a couple of feet along one side of the lead coffin, and then across and down the other side. Van Helsing forced back the leaden flange, and we all looked in, and recoiled. The coffin was empty. So far there is much that is strange. Wait you with me outside, unseen and unheard, and things much stranger are yet to be. So, here he shut the dark slide of his lantern, now to the outside. He opened the door, and we filed out, he coming last and locking the door behind him. First he took from his bag a mass of what looked like thin, wafer-like biscuit, which was carefully rolled up in a white napkin. Next he took out a double handful of some whitish stuff like dough or putty. He crumbled the wafer up fine and worked it into the mass between his hands. This he then took, and rolling it into thin strips, began to lay them into the crevices between the door and its setting in the tomb. I was somewhat puzzled at this, and being close, asked him what it was that he was doing. Arthur and Quincy drew near also, as they too were curious. He answered, "I am closing the tomb so that the undead may not enter." "And is that stuff you've put there going to do it?" asked Quincy. "Great Scott, is this a game?" "It is." "What is that which you are using?" This time the question was by Arthur. Van Helsing reverently lifted his hat as he answered, "The host. I brought it from Amsterdam. I have an indulgence." In respectful silence we took the places assigned to us, close round the tomb, but hidden from the sight of anyone approaching. There was a long spell of silence, a big aching void, and then from the professor a keen "Sst." He pointed, and far down the avenue of yews we saw a white figure advance, a dim white figure which held something dark at its breast. The figure stopped, and at the moment a ray of moonlight fell between the masses of driving clouds and showed in startling prominence a dark-haired woman dressed in the cerements of the grave. We could not see the face, for it was bent down over what we saw to be a fair-haired child. There was a pause, and a sharp little cry, such as a child gives in sleep or a dog as it lies before the fire and dreams. We were starting forward, but the professor's warning hand, seen by us as he stood behind a yew tree, kept us back. And then as we looked, the white figure moved forward again. It was now near enough for us to see clearly, and the moonlight still held. My own heart grew cold as ice, and I could hear the gasp of Arthur as we recognized the features of Lucy Westenra. Lucy Westenra, but yet how changed! The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. Van Helsing stepped out, and obedient to his gesture, we all advanced too, the four of us ranged in a line before the door of the tomb. Van Helsing raised his lantern and drew the slide. By the concentrated light that fell on Lucy's face, we could see that the lips were crimson with fresh blood, and that the stream had trickled over her chin and stained the purity of her lawn death-robe. We shuddered with horror. I could see by the tremulous light that even Van Helsing's iron nerve had failed. Arthur was next to me, and if I had not seized his arm and held him up, he would have fallen. When Lucy— I call the thing that was before us Lucy because it bore her shape— saw us, she drew back with an angry snarl, such as a cat gives when taken unawares. Then her eyes ranged over us. Lucy's eyes in form and colour, but Lucy's eyes unclean and full of hell fire instead of the pure, gentle orbs we knew. At that moment, the remnant of my love passed into hate and loathing. Had she then to be killed, I could have done it with savage delight. As she looked, her eyes blazed with unholy light, and the face became wreathed with a voluptuous smile. Oh, God, how it made me shudder to see it! With a careless motion, she flung to the ground, callous as a devil, the child that up to now she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone. The child gave a sharp cry and lay there moaning. There was a cold-bloodedness in the act which wrung a groan from Arthur. When she advanced to him with outstretched arms and a wanton smile, he fell back and hid his face in his hands. She still advanced, however, and with a languorous, voluptuous grace said, "Come to me, Arthur. Leave these others and come to me. My arms are hungry for you. Come, and we can rest together. Come, my husband, come." There was something diabolically sweet in her tones, something of the tingling of glass when struck, which rang through the brains even of us who heard the words addressed to another. As for Arthur, he seemed under a spell. Moving his hands from his face, he opened wide his arms. She was leaping for them when Van Helsing sprang forward and held between them his little golden crucifix. She recoiled from it, and with a suddenly distorted face full of rage, dashed past him as if to enter the tomb. When within a foot or two of the door, however, she stopped as if arrested by some irresistible force. Then she turned, and her face was shown in the clear burst of moonlight, and by the lamp, which had now no quiver from Van Helsing's iron nerves. Never did I see such baffled malice on a face, and never, I trust, shall such ever be seen again by mortal eyes. The beautiful colour became livid. The eyes seemed to throw out sparks of hell fire. The brows were wrinkled, as though the folds of the flesh were the coils of Medusa's snakes, and the lovely blood-stained mouth grew to an open square, as in the passion masks of the Greeks and Japanese. If ever a face meant death, if looks could kill, we saw it at that moment. And so, for full half a minute, which seemed an eternity, she remained between the lifted crucifix and the sacred closing of her means of entry. Van Helsing broke the silence by asking Arthur, "Answer me, O my friend, am I to proceed in my work?" Arthur threw himself on his knees and hid his face in his hands as he answered, "Do as you will, friend, do as you will. There can be no horror like this, ever any more." And he groaned in spirit. Quincy and I simultaneously moved towards him and took his arms. We could hear the click of the closing lantern as Van Helsing held it down. Coming close to the tomb, he began to remove from the chinks some of the sacred emblem which he had placed there. We all looked on in horrified amazement as we saw, when he stood back, the woman with a corporeal body as real at the moment as our own, pass in through the interstice where scarce a knife blade could have gone. We silently, and as if by ordered intention, followed the professor. He unlocked the door, and we entered, closing it behind us. When he again lifted the lid off Lucy's coffin, we all looked, Arthur trembling like an aspen, and saw that the body lay there in all its death beauty. But there was no love in my own heart, nothing but loathing for the foul thing which had taken Lucy's shape without her soul. I could see even Arthur's face grow hard as he looked. Presently he said to Van Helsing, "Is this really Lucy's body, or only a demon in her shape?" "It is her body, and yet not it. But wait a while, and you shall see her as she was and is." She seemed like a nightmare of Lucy as she lay there. The pointed teeth, the blood-stained voluptuous mouth, which it made one shudder to see, the whole carnal and unspiritual appearance seeming like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. Van Helsing, in his methodical manner, began taking the various contents from his bag and placing them ready for use. First he took out a soldering iron and some plumbing solder, and then a small oil lamp, which gave out, when lit in a corner of the tomb, gas which burned at fierce heat with a blue flame. Then his operating knives, which he placed to hand, and last, a round wooden stake some 2 inches thick. One end of it was hardened by charring in the fire, and was sharpened to a fine point. With this stake came a heavy hammer, such as in households is used in the coal cellar for breaking the lumps. When all was ready, Van Helsing said, "Before we do anything, let me tell you this. It is out of the lore and experience of the ancients, and of all those who have studied the powers of the undead. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead. So that, my friend, it will be a blessed hand for her that shall strike the blow that sets her free." We all looked at Arthur. He saw, too, what we all did, the infinite kindness which suggested that his should be the hand which would restore Lucy to us as a holy and not an unholy memory. He stepped forward and said bravely, though his hand trembled and his face was as pale as snow, "My true friend, from the bottom of my broken heart, I thank you. Tell me what I am to do, and I shall not falter." Van Helsing laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "Take this stake in your left hand, ready to place the point over the heart, and the hammer in your right. Then, when we begin our prayer for the dead, I shall read him. I have here the book, and the others shall follow. Strike in God's name, that so all may be well with the dead that we love, and that the undead pass away." Arthur took the stake and the hammer, and when once his mind was set on action, his hands never trembled nor even quivered. Van Helsing opened his missal and began to read, and Quincy and I followed as well we could. Arthur placed the point over the heart, and as I looked, I could see its dint in the white flesh. Then he struck with all his might. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with a crimson foam. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like a figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. His face was set, and high duty seemed to shine through it. The sight of it gave us courage, so that our voices seemed to ring through the little vault. And then the writhing and quivering of the body became less, and the teeth ceased to champ and the face to quiver. Finally, it lay still. The terrible task was over. There, in the coffin, lay no longer the foul thing that we had so dreaded and grown to hate, but Lucy, as we had seen her in her life, with her face of unequalled sweetness and purity. But Lucy, as we had seen her in her life, with her face of unequalled sweetness and purity. True that there were there, as we had seen them in life, the traces of care and pain and waste, but these were all dear to us, for they marked her truth to what we knew. One and all, we felt that the holy calm that lay like sunshine over the wasted face and form was only an earthly token and symbol of the calm that was to reign forever. Arthur bent and kissed her, and then we sent him and Quincy out of the tomb. The professor and I sawed the top off the stake, leaving the point of it in the body. Then we cut off the head and filled the mouth with garlic. We soldered up the leaden coffin, screwed on the coffin lid, and gathering up our belongings, came away. When we arrived at the Berkeley Hotel, Van Helsing found a telegram waiting for him. I'm coming up by train. Jonathan with me. Important news. Mina Harker. 30th September. The Harkers arrived at 9 o'clock. Mr. Harker is uncommonly clever, if one can judge from his face, and full of energy. If his journal be true, and judging by one's own wonderful experiences, it must be, he is also a man of great nerve. After lunch, Harker and his wife went back to their own room, and as I passed a while ago, I heard the click of the typewriter. They are hard at it. Mrs. Harker says that they are knitting together in chronological order every scrap of evidence they have. Harker has got the letters between the consignee of the boxes at Whitby and the carriers in London who took charge of them. Strange that it never struck me that the very next house might be the Count's hiding place. Goodness knows that we had enough clues from the conduct of the patient Renfield. I got home at 5 o'clock and found that Arthur Holmwood and Morris had not only arrived, but had already studied the transcript of the various diaries and letters which Harker and his wonderful wife had made and arranged. Mrs. Harker gave us a cup of tea, and I can honestly say that for the first time since I have lived in it, this old house seemed like home. Of one thing we are now satisfied, that all the boxes which arrived at Whitby from Varna in the Demeter were safely deposited in the old chapel of Carfax. There should be 50 of them there, unless any have since been removed, as I fear. I went to the station to meet Van Helsing. As I drove to the house, I told him of what had passed, and what we had found in his absence, that the house which Dracula had bought was the very next one to my own. He was amazed, and a great concern seemed to come on him. "Oh, that we had known it before," he said, "for then we might have reached him in time to save poor Lucy." Then he fell into a silence that lasted till we entered my own gateway. Mina Harker's Journal. 30th September. When we met in Dr. Seward's study 2 hours after dinner, which had been at 6 o'clock, we unconsciously formed a sort of board or committee. The professor began to speak. "There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. This vampire which is amongst us is of himself so strong in person as 20 men. He is of cunning more than mortal, for his cunning be the growth of ages. He have still the aids of necromancy, the divination by the dead. He is brute and more than brute. He is devil in callous, and the heart of him is not. He can, within limitations, appear at will, when and where, and in any of the forms that are to him. He can, within his range, direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder. He can transform himself to wolf. He can be as bat. He can come in mist which he create. He come on moonlight rays as elemental dust. He becomes so small. We ourselves saw Miss Lucy, ere she was at peace, slip through a hairbreadth space at the tomb door. He can see in the dark. No small power, this, in a world which is one half shut from the light. Ah, but hear me through. He can do all these things, yet he is not free. He cannot go where he lists. He who is not of nature has yet to obey some of nature's laws. Why? We know not. He may not enter anywhere at the first, unless there be someone of the household who bid him to come, though afterwards he can come as he please. His power ceases, as does that of all evil things at the coming of the day. Only at certain times can he have limited freedom. If he be not at the place whither he is bound, he can only change himself at noon or at exact sunrise or sunset. Thus he can do as he will within his limit. When he have his earth home, his coffin home, his hell home, the place unhallowed. It is said, too, that he can only pass running water at the slack or the flood of the tide. Then there are things which so afflict him that he has no power, as the garlic that we know of. And as for things sacred, as this symbol, my crucifix, the vampire live on and cannot die by mere passing of the time. He can flourish when that he can fatten on the blood of the living, but he cannot flourish without it. Thus, when we find the habitation of this man that was, we can confine him to his coffin and destroy him if we obey what we know. My friends, this is much. It is a terrible task that we undertake, and there may be consequence to make the brave shudder. And now we must settle what we do. We know from the inquiry of Jonathan that from the castle to Whitby came 50 boxes of earth, all of which were delivered at Carfax. We also know that at least some of these boxes have been removed. It seems to me that our first step should be to ascertain whether all the rest remain in the house beyond that wall, or whether any more have been removed. And now for you, Madame Mina, This night is the end, until all be well. You are too precious to us to have such risk. When we part tonight, you no more must question. We shall tell you all in good time." All the men, even Jonathan, seemed relieved. Their minds were made up, and though it was a bitter pill for me to swallow, I could say nothing save to accept their chivalrous care of me. They have now gone off to Carfax, with means to get into the house. Dr. Seward's Diary, 1st October, 7 a.m. Last night we took our way to the old house, taking care to keep in the shadows of the trees on the lawn when the moonlight shone out. When we got to the porch, the professor tried one of 2 skeleton keys, his mechanical dexterity as a surgeon standing him in good stead. Presently he got one to suit. After a little play back and forward, the bolt yielded, and with a rusty clang shot back. We pressed on the door. The rusty hinges creaked, and it slowly opened. The professor was the first to move forward, and stepped into the open door. "In manus tuas, Domine," he said, crossing himself as he passed over the threshold. We closed the door behind us. Then we all lit our lamps and proceeded on our search. October 2nd. Today we had agreed that I should look up Thomas Snelling. He was the carter who took away the boxes from Carfax when Renfield attacked him. I drove to Walworth and found Mr. Snelling at home. He told me that he had made 2 journeys between Carfax and a house in Piccadilly, and had taken from this house to the latter 21 boxes. So having paid my friend for the exact address, I returned home. When I told the others of my findings, Van Helsing said, "This has been a great day's work. Doubtless we are on the track of the missing boxes. If we find them all in that house, then our work is near the end. But if there be some missing, we must search until we find them. Then shall we make our final coup and hunt the wretch to his real death." 3rd October. Let me put down with exactness all that happened as well as I can remember it. Not a detail that I can recall must be forgotten. In all calmness, I must proceed. This evening, the attendant came bursting into my room and told me that Renfield had somehow met with some accident. When I came to Renfield's room, I found him lying on the floor on his left side in a glittering pool of blood. And within a very few minutes the professor appeared, and we went into a strict examination of the patient. The professor thought a moment and said, "We must reduce the pressure and get back to normal conditions as far as can be. We must trephine at once, or it may be too late." "I'll be quiet, Doctor. Tell him to take off the straight waistcoat. I've had a terrible dream, and it has left me so weak that I cannot move." I said in a quiet, grave tone, "Tell us your dream, Mr. Renfield." As he heard my voice, he looked at me piercingly with an agonized confusion which I will never forget, and said, "I must not deceive myself. It was no dream, but all a grim reality. I am dying. I feel that I have but a few minutes, and then I must go back to death, or worse. I have something that I must say before I die, or before my poor crushed brain dies anyhow." His hand came out and met mine and gripped it hard. I nodded slightly, and Renfield proceeded. He came up to the window in the mist, as I had seen him often before, but he was solid then, not a ghost, and his eyes were fierce, like a man's when angry. Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself opening the sash and saying to him, "Come in, Lord and Master." He slid into the room through the sash, though it was only open an inch wide. He sneered at me, and his white face looked out of the mist with his red eyes gleaming, and he went on as though he owned the whole place, and I was no one. He didn't even smell the same as he went by me. I thought that somehow Mrs. Harker had come into the room. The professor started and quivered. His face, however, grew grimmer and sterner still. Renfield went on without noticing. It made me mad to know that he had been taking the life out of her. His voice was becoming fainter, and Van Helsing stood up instinctively. "We know the worst now," he said. "He is here, and we know his purpose. It may not be too late, but there is not an instant to spare." We all hurried to the Harkers' door. Arthur and Quincy held back, and the latter said, "Should we disturb her?" "We must," said Van Helsing grimly. He turned the handle as he spoke, but the door did not yield. We threw ourselves against it. With a crash it burst open. What I saw appalled me. I felt my hair rise like bristles on the back of my neck, and my heart seemed to stand still. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. On the bed, beside the window, lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed and breathing heavily as though in a stupor. Kneeling on the near edge of the bed, facing outwards, was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her side stood a tall, thin man, clad in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw it, we all recognized the Count in every way, even to the scar on his forehead. With his left hand he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn-open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. As we burst into the room, the Count turned his face, and the hellish look that I had heard described seemed to leap into it. His eyes flamed red with devilish passion. The great nostrils of the white aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edge, and the white, sharp teeth behind the full lips of the blood-dripping mouth champed together like those of a wild beast. With a wrench which threw his victim back upon the bed as though hurled from a height, he turned and sprang at us. But by this time the professor had gained his feet and was holding towards him the envelope which contained the sacred wafer. The Count suddenly stopped, just as poor Lucy had done outside the tomb, and cowered back. Further and further back he cowered as we, lifting our crucifixes, advanced. The moonlight suddenly failed as a great black cloud sailed across the sky, and when the gaslight sprang up under Quincy's match, we saw nothing but a faint vapor. Van Helsing, Arthur, and I moved forward to Mrs. Harker, who by this time had drawn her breath, and with it had given a scream so wild, so ear-piercing, so despairing, that it seems to me now that it will ring in my ears till my dying day. For a few seconds she lay in her helpless attitude and disarray. Her face was ghastly, with a pallor which was accentuated by the blood which smeared her lips and cheeks and chin. From her throat trickled a thin stream of blood. Her eyes were mad with terror. Then she put before her face her poor crushed hands, which bore on their whiteness the red mark of the Count's terrible grip. And from behind them came a low, desolate wail, which made the terrible scream seem only the quick expression of an endless grief. At the instant, I heard Harker's quick exclamation as he woke to partial consciousness and turned to the bed. "In God's name, what does this mean?" Harker cried out. "Dr. Seward, Dr. Van Helsing, what is it? What has happened? What is wrong? Mina, dear, what is it? What does that blood mean? Oh, my God, has it come to this?" And raising himself to his knees, he beat his hands wildly together. "Good God, help us! Help her! Oh, help her!" Van Helsing and I tried to calm them both. "Madame Mina, poor dear Madame Mina, tell us exactly what happened. God knows that I do not want that you be pained, but it is need that we know all." The poor dear lady shivered, and I could see the tension of her nerves as she clasped her husband closer to her and bent her head lower and lower still on his breast. "I woke," she said, "and felt the sense of some presence. I turned to wake Jonathan, but found that he slept soundly. I tried, but I could not wake him. This caused me a great fear, and I looked around, terrified. Then, indeed, my heart sank within me. Beside the bed, as if he had stepped out of the mist, or rather, as if the mist had turned into his figure, for it had entirely disappeared, stood a tall, thin man, all in black. I knew him at once from the descriptions of the others. The waxen face, the high aquiline nose, on which the light fell in a thin white line, the parted red lips, with the sharp white teeth showing between, and the red eyes. I knew, too, the red scar on his forehead, where Jonathan had struck him. For an instant my heart stood still, and I would have screamed out, only that I was paralyzed. In the pause he spoke, in a sort of keen, cutting whisper, pointing as he spoke to Jonathan. "Silence. If you make a sound, I shall take him and dash his brains out before your very eyes." I was appalled, and was too bewildered to do or say anything. With a mocking smile, he placed one hand upon my shoulder, and holding me tight, bared my throat with the other, saying as he did so, "First, a little refreshment to reward my exertions. You may as well be quiet. It is not the first time or the second that your veins have appeased my thirst." I was bewildered, and strangely enough, I did not want to hinder him. I suppose it is a part of the horrible curse that this happens when his touch is on his victim. And oh, my God, pity me. He placed his reeking lips upon my throat. Her husband groaned again. She clasped his hand harder and looked at him pityingly as if he was the injured one, and went on. I felt my strength fading away, and I was in a half swoon. How long this terrible thing lasted I know not, but it seemed that a long time must have passed before he took his awful, foul, sneering mouth away. I saw it drip with the fresh blood. The remembrance seemed for a while to overpower her, and she drooped and would have sunk down but for her husband's sustaining arm. With a great effort, she recovered herself and went on. Then he spoke to me mockingly. "And so You, like the others, would play your brains against mine. You would help these men to hunt me and frustrate me in my designs. You are to be punished for what you have done. You have aided in thwarting me. Now you shall come to my call. When my brain says, come to you, you shall cross land or sea to do my bidding, and to that end, this. With that, he pulled open his shirt, and with his long, sharp nails opened a vein in his breast. When the blood began to spurt out, he took my hands in one of his, holding them tight, and with the other he seized my neck and pressed my mouth to the wound, so that I must either suffocate or swallow some of the... Oh, my God, what have I done? As she was telling her terrible story, the eastern sky began to quicken. Of this I am sure. The sun rises today on no more miserable house in all the great round of its daily course. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 3rd October. As I must do something or go mad, I write this diary. We all met this morning in the study. It was agreed that before starting for Piccadilly we should destroy the Count's lair close at hand. So I started up, crying out, "Then in God's name let us go at once, for we are losing time." Van Helsing stood up and said, "Now, my dear friends, we go forth to our terrible enterprise. Madame Mina, let me guard yourself. On your forehead I touch this piece of sacred wafer, in the name of the Father, the Son, and—" There was a fearful scream, which almost froze our hearts to hear. As he had placed the wafer on Mina's forehead, it had seared it. It had burned into the flesh as though it had been a piece of white-hot metal. Pulling her beautiful hair over her face, as the leper of old his mantle, she wailed out, "Unclean, unclean! Even the Almighty shuns my polluted flesh. I must bear this mark of shame upon my forehead until the judgment day." They all paused. I had thrown myself beside her in an agony of helpless grief. Then Van Helsing turned and said gravely, "Oh, Madame Mina, my dear, may we who love you be there to see when that red scar, the sign of God's knowledge of what has been, shall pass away and leave your forehead as pure as the heart we know." There was hope in his words, and comfort, and they made for resignation. So I said farewell to Mina, a parting which neither of us shall forget to our dying day, and we set out. We entered Carfax without trouble, and found all things the same as on the first occasion. Van Helsing took from his bag a screwdriver and a wrench, and very soon the top of one of the cases was thrown open. Taking from his box a piece of the sacred wafer, he laid it reverently on the earth, and then shutting down the lid began to screw it home, we aiding him as he worked. One by one we treated in the same way each of the great boxes, and left them as we had found them to all appearance. But in each was a portion of the host. When we closed the door behind us, the professor said solemnly, "So much is already done. If it may be that with all the others we can be so successful, then the sunset of this evening may shine on Madame Mina's forehead, all white as ivory and with no stain." We went quickly to the station to catch our train, and arrived at the house in Piccadilly in the early afternoon. Using our skeleton keys, we entered the house, which smelt vilely, like the old chapel at Carfax, and with our previous experience it was plain to us that the Count had been using the place pretty freely. We moved to explore the house, all keeping together in case of attack. For we knew we had a strong and wily enemy to deal with, and as yet we did not know whether the Count might not be in the house. When we closed the door behind us, the Professor said solemnly, "So much is already done. If it may be that with all the others we can be so successful, then the sunset of this evening may shine on Madame Mina's forehead, all white as ivory and with no stain." We went quickly to the station to catch our train, and arrived at the house in Piccadilly in the early afternoon. Using our skeleton keys, we entered the house, which smelt vilely, like the old chapel at Carfax, and with our previous experience it was plain to us that the Count had been using the place pretty freely. We moved to explore the house, all keeping together in case of attack, for we knew we had a strong and wily enemy to deal with, and as yet we did not know whether the Count might not be in the house. In the dining room, which lay at the back of the hall, we found 20 boxes of earth. 20 boxes only out of the 21 which we sought. Our work was not over, and would never be until we should have found the missing box. We did not lose any time in examining the chests. With the tools which we had brought with us, we opened them one by one, and treated them as we had treated those others in the old chapel. It was evident to us that the Count was not at present in the house, and we proceeded to await his return. Then, late in the afternoon, we heard a key softly inserted in the lock of the hall door. We waited in a suspense that made the seconds pass with nightmare slowness. The slow, careful steps came along the hall. The Count was evidently prepared for some surprise. At least, he feared it. Suddenly, with a single bound, he leaped into the room, winning a way past us before any of us could raise a hand to stay him. There was something so panther-like in the movement, something so unhuman, that it seemed to sober us all from the shock of his coming. As the Count saw us, a horrible sort of snarl passed over his face, showing the eye-teeth long and pointed. But the evil smile as quickly passed into a cold stare of lion-like disdain. His expression again changed, as with a single impulse we all advanced upon him. It was a pity that we had not some better organized plan of attack, for even at the moment I wondered what we were to do. I did not myself know whether our lethal weapons would avail us anything. I meant to try the matter, for I had ready my great cookery knife, and made a fierce and sudden cut at him. The blow was a powerful one. Only the diabolical quickness of the Count's leap back saved him. A second less, and the trenchant blade had shorn through his heart. As it was, the point just cut the cloth of his coat, making a wide gap whence a bundle of banknotes and a stream of gold fell out. It would be impossible to describe the expression of hate and baffled malignity, of anger and hellish rage which came over the Count's face. His waxen hue became greenish-yellow by the contrast of his burning eyes, and the red scar on the forehead showed on the pallid skin like a palpitating wound. The next instant, with a sinuous dive, he grasped a handful of the money from the floor, dashed across the room, and threw himself at the window. Amid the crash and glitter of the falling glass, he tumbled into the flagged area below. We ran over and saw him spring unhurt from the ground. He, rushing up the steps, crossed the flagged yard and pushed open the stable door. Then he turned and spoke to us.
"You think to baffle me, you with your pale faces all in a row like sheep in a butcher's. You shall be sorry yet, each one of you. You think you have left me without a place to rest, but I have more. My revenge is just begun. I spread it over centuries, and time is on my side. Your girls that you all love are mine already, and through them you and others shall yet be mine, my creatures, to do my bidding and to be my jackals when I want to feed.
With a contemptuous sneer, he passed quickly through the door, and we heard the rusty bolt creak as he fastened it behind him. We had to recognize that our game was up. With heavy hearts, we came back to the house, where we found Mina awaiting us with an appearance of cheerfulness which did honor to her bravery and unselfishness. There was no place for words in my sublime misery. There was over me a yearning for sleep, in some sort of blind belief that to wake would be to find things changed, and that any change must now be for the better. But during the night I was wakened by Mina. "Go and call the professor. I want to see him at once." "Why?" I asked. "I have an idea. Go quick, dearest. The time is getting close." 2 or 3 minutes later, Van Helsing was in the room in his dressing gown, and Mr. Morris and Arthur were with Dr. Seward at the door. "And what am I to do for you? For at this hour you do not want me for nothings." "I want you to hypnotize me," she said. "Do it before the dawn, for I feel that then I can speak, and speak freely. Be quick, for the time is short." Without a word, he motioned her to sit up in bed. Looking fixedly at her, he commenced to make passes in front of her, from over the top of her head downward with each hand in turn. Mina gazed at him fixedly for a few minutes, during which my own heart beat like a trip-hammer, for I felt that some crisis was at hand. Gradually her eyes closed, and she sat stock still. The stillness was broken by Van Helsing's voice, speaking in a low, level tone which would not break the current of her thoughts. "Where are you now?" The answer came dreamily, but with intention. It was as though she were interpreting something. "I do not know. It is all strange to me." "What do you see?" "I can see nothing. It is all dark." "What do you hear?" I could detect the strain in the professor's patient voice. "The lapping of water. It is gurgling by, and little waves leap. I can hear them on the outside." "Then you are on a ship." We all looked at each other, trying to glean something each from the other. We were afraid to think. The answer came quick. "Oh, yes." "What are you doing?" "I am still, oh, so still. It is like death." The voice faded away into a deep breath, as of someone sleeping, and the open eyes closed again. By this time, the sun had risen, and we were all in the full light of the day. Dr. Van Helsing placed his hands on Mina's shoulders and laid her head down softly on her pillow. She lay like a sleeping child for a few moments, and then with a long sigh awoke and stared in wonder to see us all around her. "Have I been talking in my sleep?" was all she said. She seemed, however, to know the situation without telling. The professor repeated the conversation and said, "We can know now what was in the Count's mind when he seized that money. Though Jonathan's so fierce knife put him in the danger that even he dread. He meant escape. Hear me, escape. He saw that with but one earth box left, and a pack of men following like dogs after a fox, this London was no place for him. He have take his last earth box on board a ship, and he leave the land. He think to escape, but no. We follow him." "5th October, 5 p.m. Our meeting for report. Dr. Van Helsing described what steps were taken during the day to discover on what boat and whither bound Count Dracula made his escape. As I knew that he wanted to get back to Transylvania, I felt sure that he must go by the Danube mouth, or by somewhere in the Black Sea, since by that way he come. We find that only one Black Sea-bound ship go out with the tide. She is the Tsarina Catherine, and she sailed for Varna. She left the Thames yesterday morning. It will take her at the quickest speed she has ever made at least 3 weeks to reach Varna, but we can travel overland to the same place in 3 days. We shall be in Varna before the ship arrives, and able to make such preparations as may be necessary. Of course, we shall all go armed against evil things, spiritual as well as physical. Tonight and tomorrow we can get ready, and then, if all be well, we can set out on our journey. Dr. Seward's Diary. 15th October, Varna. Jonathan Harker has asked me to note this, as he says he is hardly equal to the task, and he wants an exact record kept. We left Charing Cross on the morning of the 12th, got to Paris the same night, and took the places secured for us in the Orient Express. We travelled night and day, arriving here at about 5 o'clock. The journey may have had incidents. I was, however, too eager to get on to care for them. Until the Tsarina Catherine comes into port, there will be no interest for me in anything in the wide world. 23rd October. A whole week of waiting. Daily telegram from Lloyd's of London to Arthur, but only the same story. Not yet reported. Van Helsing is terribly anxious, and told me just now that he fears the Count is escaping us. 28th October. Telegram. Tsarina Catherine reported entering Galatz at 1 o'clock today. When the telegram came announcing the arrival at Galatz, I did not think it was such a shock to any of us as might have been expected. True, we did not know whence or how or when the boat would come, but I think we all expected that something strange would happen. Mrs. Harker said at once, "I felt it. Oh, I felt it." All that haunts me is a fear lest in some trance or dream he may have used my knowledge for his ends. The professor stood up. "He has so used your mind, and by it he has left us here in Varna, whilst the ship that carried him rushed through enveloping fog up to Galatz, where doubtless he had made preparation for escaping from us. But his child mind only saw so far, and it may be that, as ever is in God's providence, the very thing that the evildoer most reckoned on for his selfish good turns out to be his chiefest harm." 30th October. We travelled by night train and arrived in Galatz at 8. At 9 o'clock, Dr. Van Helsing and I called on the Tsarina Catherine, which lay at anchor out in the river harbour. There we saw the captain, Donaldson by name, who told us of his voyage. He said that in all his life he had never had so favourable a run. He had received a letter from London telling him to deliver the box before sunrise so as to avoid customs. To a certain Petrov Skinsky, who dealt with Slovaks who traded down the river to the port. He had been paid for his work and handed over the box. That was all he knew. As we came home, we could arrive at no definite conclusion. We were all convinced that the box was on its way by water to somewhere. But where that might be, we would have to discover. With heavy hearts, we came home to the hotel to Mina. Mina Harker's Journal. October 30th. On the return of Professor Van Helsing and Dr. Seward, I examined the map and find that the river most suitable for the Slovaks to have ascended is either the Prut or the Seret. Now, of these two, The Prut is the more easily navigated, but the Seret is at Fondu, joined by the Bistritza, which runs up round the Borgo Pass. The loop it makes is manifestly as close to Dracula's castle as can be got by water. When I had shown this to the others, Jonathan took me in his arms and kissed me. Dr. Van Helsing said, "Now we are on the track once again, and this time we may succeed. Our enemy is at his most helpless, and if we can come on him by day on the water, our task will be over." "I shall get a steam launch and follow him," said Arthur Holmwood. "And I, horses to follow on the bank, lest by chance he land," said Mr. Morris. "Good," said the Professor. "Both good. But neither must go alone. There must be force to overcome force, if need be. The Slovak is strong and rough, and he carries rude arms." All the men smiled, for amongst them they carried a small arsenal. "Meanwhile, friend Jonathan, be not afraid for Madame Mina. She will be my care, if I may. I am old. My legs are not so quick to run as once, and I am not used to ride so long, or to pursue as need be, or to fight with lethal weapons. But I can be of other service. Whilst the old fox is tied in his box floating on the running stream whence he cannot escape to land, we shall go in the track where Jonathan went, from Bistritz over the Borgo, and find our way to the castle of Dracula. Here, Madame Mina's hypnotic power will surely help, and we shall find our way to that fateful place. There is much to be done, and other places to be made sanctify, so that nest of vipers be obliterated." Here Jonathan interrupted him hotly. "Do you mean to say, Professor Van Helsing, that you would bring Mina right into the jaws of his death trap?" "Oh, my friend, it is because I would save Madame Mina from that awful place that I would go. Forgive me that I make you so much pain, but it is necessary." "Do as you will," said Jonathan, with a sob that shook him all over. "We are in the hands of God." 1st November. All day long we have travelled by carriage, and at a good speed. The Professor seems tireless. All day he would not take any rest, though he made me sleep for a long spell. At sunset time he hypnotized me, and he says that I answered as usual. Darkness, lapping water, and creaking wood. So our enemy is still on the river. 2nd November, night. All day long driving. The country gets wider as we go, and the great spurs of the Carpathians, which at first seemed so far from us and so low on the horizon, now seem to gather round us and tower in front. Dr. Van Helsing says that by tomorrow we shall reach the Borgo Pass. Jonathan Harker's Journal. 1st November, night. I am writing this in the light from the furnace door of the steam launch. Arthur is an experienced hand at the work, as he has had for years a launch of his own on the Thames. Mr. Morris and Dr. Seward were off on their long ride before we started. They are to keep up the right bank, far enough off to get on higher lands, where they can see a good stretch of river and avoid the following of its curves. They have spare horses, 4 in all. It may be necessary for us to join forces. If so, they can mount our whole party. It is a wild adventure we are on. Here, as we are rushing along through the darkness, with the cold from the river seeming to rise up and strike us, with all the mysterious voices of the night around us, it all comes home. We seem to be drifting into unknown places and unknown ways, into a whole world of dark and dreadful things. Arthur is shutting the furnace door. Dr. Seward's Diary. 2nd November. 3 days on the road, no news and no time to write it if there had been, for every moment is precious.
We have had only the rest needful for the horses, but we are both bearing it wonderfully. I wish it wasn't so cold. There are signs of snow coming, and if it falls heavy, it will stop us. We must push on harder than ever. Our help may be wanted soon. Memorandum by Abraham Van Helsing. 5th November, morning. This to my old and true friend John Seward, M.D. of Purfleet, London, in case I may not see him. It may explain. It is morning, and I write by a fire which all the night I have kept alive, Madame Mina aiding me. It is cold, cold, so cold that the grey heavy sky is full of snow. It seems to have affected Madame Mina. She has been so heavy of head all day that she was not like herself. She sleeps and sleeps. All yesterday we travel, ever getting closer to the mountains and moving into a more and more wild and desert land. Then, ere the great dark came upon us, and all was for a time in a great twilight, I took out the horses and fed them in what shelter I could. Then I make a fire, and near it I make Madame Mina, now wake and more charming than ever, sit comfortable amid her rugs. I got ready food, but she would not eat, simply saying that she had not hunger. I did not press her, but I myself eat, for I must needs now be strong for all. Then, with a fear on me of what might be, I drew a ring so big for her comfort round where Madame Mina sat, and over the ring I passed some of the wafer, and I broke it fine, so that all was well guarded. She sat still all the time, so still as one dead, and she grew whiter and ever whiter till the snow was not more pale, and no word she said. But when I drew near, she clung to me, and I could know that the poor soul shook from head to feet with a tremor that was pain to feel. Presently the horses began to scream and tore at their tethers. Even in the dark there was a light of some kind, and it seemed as though the snow flurries and the wreaths of mist took shape as of women with trailing garments. Then they began to materialize, still, if God have not taken away my reason, for I saw it through my eyes, there was before me, in actual flesh, the same three women that Jonathan saw in the room when they would have kissed his throat. I knew the swaying round forms, the bright hard eyes, the white teeth, the ruddy color, the voluptuous lips. They smiled ever at poor dear Madame Mina, and as their laugh came through the silence of the night, they twined their arms and pointed to her, and said in those so sweet, tingling tones that Jonathan said were of the intolerable sweetness of the water glasses, "Come, sister, come to us. Come, come." In fear, I turned to my poor Madame Mina, and my heart with gladness leapt like flame. For oh, the terror in her sweet eyes, the repulsion, the horror, told a story to my heart that was all of hope. God be thanked, she was not yet of them. The horses had ceased to moan, and lay still on the ground. The snow fell on them softly, and they grew whiter. I knew that there was for the poor beasts no more of terror. And so we remained till the red of the dawn began to fall through the snow gloom. I was desolate and afraid, and full of woe and terror. But when that beautiful sun began to climb the horizon, life was to me again. At the first coming of the dawn, the horrid figures melted in the whirling mist and snow.
The wreaths of transparent gloom moved away towards the castle and were lost. 5th November, afternoon. I am at least sane. Thank God for that mercy at all events, though the proving has been dreadful. When I left Madame Mina sleeping within the holy circle, I took my way to the castle. Jonathan's bitter experience served me here. By memory of his diary, I found my way to the old chapel, for I knew that here my work lay. I knew that there were at least 3 graves to find, graves that are inhabit. So I search, and I find one of them. She lay in her vampire sleep, so full of life and voluptuous beauty that I shudder as though I have come to do murder. I doubt not that in old time, when such things were, many a man who set forth to do such a task as mine found at the last his heart fail him, and then his nerve. So he delay, and delay, and delay, till the mere beauty and the fascination of the wanton undead have hypnotized him, and he remain on, till sunset come, and the vampire sleep be over. Then the beautiful eyes of the fair woman open and look love, and the voluptuous mouth present to a kiss, and man is weak. And there remained one more victim in the vampire fold, one more to swell the grim and grisly ranks of the undead. Certain it was that I was lapsing into sleep, the open-eyed sleep of one who yields to a sweet fascination, when there came through the snow-stilled air a long, low wail, so full of woe and pity that it woke me like the sound of a clarion. For it was the voice of my dear Madame Mina that I heard. Then I braced myself again to my horrid task, and found by wrenching away tomb tops the other sisters. There was one great tomb, more lordly than all the rest. Huge it was, and nobly proportioned. On it was but one word: Dracula. This then was the undead home of the king vampire. Before I began to restore these women to their dead selves through my awful work, I laid in Dracula's tomb some of the wafer, and so banished him from it, undead, forever. Then began my terrible task, and I dreaded it. Had it been but one, it had been easy, comparative, but 3. I tremble, and tremble even yet, though till all was over, God be thanked, my nerve did stand. Had I not seen the repose in the first face, and the gladness that stole over it, just ere the final dissolution came, as realization that the soul had been won, I could not have gone further with my butchery. I could not have endured the horrid screeching as the stake drove home, the plunging of writhing form and lips of bloody foam. I should have fled in terror and left my work undone, but it is over. And the poor souls, I can pity them now and weep, as I think of them placid, each in her full sleep of death, for a short moment ere fading. For hardly had my knife severed the head of each, before the whole body began to melt away and crumble into its native dust, as though the death that should have come centuries agone had at last assert himself and say at once and loud, "I am here." Before I left the castle, I so fixed its entrances that never more can the Count enter there undead. When I stepped into the circle where Madame Mina slept, she woke from her sleep, and seeing me cried out in pain that I had endured too much. "Come," she said, "come away from this awful place. Let us go to meet my husband, who is, I know, coming towards us. And so, with trust and hope, and yet full of fear, we go eastward to meet our friends. Mina Harker's journal. 6 November. It was late in the afternoon when the professor and I took our way towards the east, whence I knew Jonathan was coming. We could hear the distant howling of wolves. They were far off, but the sound, even though coming muffled through the deadening snowfall, was full of terror. In a little while, the professor signalled to me. He had found a wonderful spot, a sort of natural hollow in a rock, with an entrance like a doorway between two boulders. Taking his field glasses from the case, he stood on the top of the rock and began to search the horizon. Suddenly, he called out, "Look, Madame Mina! Look! Look!" I sprang up and stood beside him on the rock. He handed me his glasses and pointed. The snow was now falling more heavily and swirled about fiercely, for a high wind was beginning to blow. However, there were times when there were pauses between the snow flurries, and I could see a group of mounted men hurrying along. In the midst of them was a cart, a long, lighter wagon, which swept from side to side like a dog's tail wagging with each stern inequality of the road. Outlined against the snow as they were, I could see from the men's clothes that they were peasants or gypsies of some kind. On the cart was a great square chest. My heart leaped as I saw it, for I felt that the end was coming. The evening was now drawing close, and well I knew that at sunset the thing which was till then imprisoned there would take new freedom, and could in any of many forms elude all pursuit.
"See,"
Van Helsing said,
"they come quickly. They are flogging the horses and galloping as hard as they can."
He paused and went on in a hollow voice,
"They are racing for the sunset. We may be too late. God's will be done." "Look! Look! See the horsemen follow fast, coming up from the south. It must be Quincy and John."
Looking around, I saw on the north side of the coming party 2 other men, riding at breakneck speed. One of them I knew was Jonathan, and the other I took, of course, to be Arthur. They too were pursuing the party with the cart. When I told the professor, he shouted in glee like a schoolboy, and after looking intently till snowfall made sight impossible, he laid his Winchester rifle ready for use against the boulder at the opening of our shelter.
"They are all converging,"
he said.
"When the time comes, we shall have the gypsies on all sides."
I got out my revolver ready to hand, for whilst we were speaking, the howling of wolves came louder and closer. The professor and I crouched down behind our rock and held our weapons ready. I could see that he was determined that they should not pass. One and all were quite unaware of our presence. All at once, 2 voices shouted out to halt. One was my Jonathan's, raised in a high key of passion. The other, Mr. Morris's strong, resolute tone of quiet command. The gypsies instinctively reined in, and at the instant Arthur and Jonathan dashed up at one side, and Dr. Seward and Mr. Morris on the other. At the same moment, Dr. Van Helsing and I rose behind the rock and pointed our weapons at them. Seeing that they were surrounded, the men tightened their reins and drew up. The leader turned to them and gave a word, at which every man of the gypsy party drew what weapon he carried, knife or pistol, and held himself in readiness to attack. Issue was joined in an instant. All 4 men of our party threw themselves from their horses and dashed towards the cart. Nothing seemed to stop or even to hinder them, neither the levelled weapons or the flashing knives of the gypsies in front, or the howling of the wolves behind appeared to even attract their attention. Jonathan's impetuosity and the manifest singleness of his purpose seemed to overawe those in front of him. Instinctively they cowered aside and let him pass. In an instant he had jumped upon the cart, and with a strength which seemed incredible, raised the great box and flung it over the wheel to the ground. In the meantime, Mr. Morris had had to use force to pass through his side of the ring of gypsies. I saw their knives flash as he won a way through them, and they cut at him. He parried with his great bowie knife, and at first I thought that he too had come through in safety. But as he sprang beside Jonathan, who had by now jumped from the cart, I could see that with his left hand he was clutching at his side, and that the blood was spurting through his fingers. He did not delay, notwithstanding this, for as Jonathan, with desperate energy, attacked one end of the chest, attempting to prise off the lid with his great cookery knife, he attacked the other frantically with his bowie. Under the efforts of both men, the lid began to yield. The nails drew with a quick screeching sound, and the top of the box was thrown back. By this time, the gypsies, seeing themselves covered by the Winchesters, had given in and made no further resistance. The sun was almost down on the mountain tops, and the shadows of the whole group fell long upon the snow. I saw the Count lying within the box upon the earth, some of which the rood falling from the cart had scattered over him. He was deathly pale, just like a waxen image, and the red eyes glared with the horrible, vindictive look which I knew too well. As I looked, the eyes saw the sinking sun, and the look of hate in them turned to triumph. But on the instant came the sweep and flash of Jonathan's great knife. I shrieked as I saw it shear through the throat, whilst at the same moment Mr. Morris's bowie knife plunged into the heart. It was like a miracle. But before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight. I shall be glad, as long as I live, that even in that moment of final dissolution, there was in the face a look of peace, such as I never could have imagined might have rested there. The castle of Dracula now stood out against the red sky, and every stone of its broken battlements was articulated against the light of the setting sun. The gypsies, taking us as in some way the cause of the extraordinary disappearance of the dead man, turned, without a word, and rode away as if for their lives. The wolves followed in their wake, leaving us alone. Mr. Morris, who had sunk to the ground, leaned on his elbow, holding his hand pressed to his side. The blood still gushed through his fingers. I flew to him, for the holy circle did not now keep me back. So did the 2 doctors. Jonathan knelt behind him, and the wounded man laid back his head on his shoulder. With a sigh, he took, with a feeble effort, my hand in that of his own, which was unstained. He must have seen the anguish of my heart in my face, for he smiled at me and said, "I am only too happy to have been of any service." "Oh, God!" he cried suddenly, struggling up to a sitting posture and pointing to me. "It was worth this to die. Look, look." The sun was now right down upon the mountain top, and the red gleams fell upon my face so that it was bathed in rosy light. With one impulse the men sank on their knees, and a deep and earnest Amen broke from all as their eyes followed the pointing of his finger as the dying man spoke. Now God be thanked that all has not been in vain. See, the snow is not more stainless than her forehead. The curse has passed away. And to our bitter grief, with a smile and in silence, he died, a gallant gentleman. Note by Jonathan Harker. 7 years ago, we all went through the flames, and the happiness of some of us since then is, we think, well worth the pain we endured. It is an added joy to Mina and to me that our boy's birthday is the same day as that on which Quincy Morris died. His mother holds, I know, the secret belief that some of our brave friend's spirit has passed into the child. We call him Quincy. Sometimes at home we talk of the old time, which we can all look back on without despair. For Arthur Homewood and Dr. Seward are both happily married. We could hardly ask anyone, even did we wish to accept proofs of so wild a story. Van Helsing summed it all up, as he said, with our boy on his knee, "We want no proofs. We ask none to believe us. This boy will some day know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on, he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare much for her sake."